Let's start with something uncomfortable. The conflicts you see in the news right now, from Venezuela to Iran, from sanctions to sudden military escalations, are not random. They are also not really about democracy, human rights, or even territory. Those are the headlines. The real story sits underneath. Because what we are watching is not a military war. It is a currency war. A war over which money the world is forced to use, which currency countries are allowed to trade in, and which reserve central banks are expected to hold. This is the war nobody announces. Because once you name it, the illusion breaks. Think about it. Why does one country sell oil the same way for decades, then suddenly get sanctioned the moment it changes how it gets paid? Why does another country endure years of pressure only to face escalation the moment it experiments outside the system? Why do leaders like Maduro become criminals, while others doing similar things are quietly tolerated? That is not coincidence. That is enforcement. Because the modern global order is built on one fragile agreement. Most of the world agrees to use the same financial rails, the same settlement systems, the same reserve logic, the same monetary center. As long as everyone plays along, the system feels stable, almost natural, like gravity. But gravity only feels natural until something starts floating. And that is exactly what countries like Venezuela and Iran attempted. Not by firing missiles, not by invading neighbors, but by questioning how money moves. That is the real red line. Once a country starts asking whether it really needs to trade this way, whether it really needs to settle in that currency, whether it really needs permission to move value, it stops being a policy debate. It becomes a threat. Because money today is not just a medium of exchange. It is a control mechanism. It decides who can buy, who can sell, who can ensure shipments, who can clear payments, who gets access to the global economy, and who gets locked out of it. And when that control is challenged, the response is never subtle. Sanctions appear, assets freeze, ships get seized. Legal cases suddenly cross borders, all without declaring war. This is why Venezuela matters. This is why Iran matters. This is why oil, sanctions, and currency keep colliding in the same parts of the world. Because the issue is not politics. It is permission. Permission to trade, permission to settle, permission to exist inside the system. And here is the part most people miss. You do not need every country to rebel. You only need a few important ones to test alternatives. Because once alternatives exist, obedience becomes optional. And once obedience becomes optional, control starts to crack. That is the fear driving everything you are seeing right now. Not chaos, not instability, loss of monetary dominance. And once you understand that, the headlines stop looking confusing. They start looking coordinated. In the next part, we are going to break down how this system actually works, not in theory, in practice. Because once you see the machinery, you will understand why stepping outside it comes with consequences. Now let's talk about pressure. Because once you understand that this is a currency war, the next thing you need to understand is why the system is panicking. And the answer starts with a number, $38 trillion. That is the size of US government debt right now, 38 trillion. It is such a large number that it almost stops meaning anything. So let's make it human. If you spent $1 every single second, it would take more than 1,000,000 years to spend that amount of money. And the United States does not have 1,000,000 years. It has debt payments, interest, deadlines. This is the quiet clock ticking behind everything. Because when a system carries that much debt, it needs one thing above all else: constant demand for its currency. As long as the world needs that currency, the debt can be rolled over, delayed, refinanced. But the moment demand weakens, the math turns brutal. This is where the Federal Reserve enters the story. In theory, the Fed is independent, neutral, technical. In reality, it sits at the center of a political trap. On one side, the government needs cheap money, lower interest rates, constant liquidity. On the other side, lower rates mean a weaker currency, higher inflation, and rising global distrust. And standing in the middle of that trap is Jerome Powell, the man whose job is to say no when everyone else wants more. More stimulus, more liquidity, more printing. Because Powell understands something most people do not. You cannot protect a currency and flood the world with it at the same time. And this is where tension explodes. When debt keeps rising, politicians stop caring about theory. They care about survival, jobs, growth, markets, elections. And suddenly monetary independence becomes an obstacle. Pressure builds, public criticism escalates, threats appear. Not because Powell is wrong, but because restraint is expensive. This internal pressure inside the United States connects directly to what happens abroad. Because when domestic stability depends on foreign demand, you cannot afford disobedience overseas. Every country that trades outside the system, every barrel of oil settled differently, every reserve held in another currency is not just an economic choice. It is a threat multiplier. This is why enforcement tightens exactly when alternatives appear. And this is where Venezuela becomes impossible to ignore. Under Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela did not just face economic collapse. It faced financial isolation, accounts frozen, assets seized, oil shipments blocked, leaders labeled criminals, not because oil stopped flowing, but because payment logic changed, because Venezuela explored settling oil outside the usual rails, outside the familiar currency logic, and that crossed the line. Once enforcement begins, the goal is no longer negotiation. It is deterrence, to show the world what happens when you experiment at the wrong time. And timing matters, because when debt is manageable, systems are tolerant. When debt reaches $38 trillion, tolerance disappears. The system does not need chaos, it needs compliance. And that is why pressure is no longer subtle. It is personal, it is legal, it is financial, it is relentless. This is not about one country or one leader. It is about protecting the demand that keeps the entire structure standing. And when that demand is threatened, everything else becomes secondary. In the next part, we're going to widen the lens. Because Venezuela is not alone. Iran is not an exception. They are part of a larger pattern. A pattern that includes oil producers, rising powers, alternative currencies, and a world that is slowly, quietly learning how to say no. Now let's bring Iran into the picture. Because if Venezuela was a warning shot, Iran is the real stress test. Venezuela challenges the system at the edge. Iran challenges it at the core. This is no longer about a struggling economy. This is about the heart of the oil trade. Iran sits in one of the most sensitive regions on the global energy map, close to shipping choke points, close to major producers, close to the pressure points of the entire system. And unlike Venezuela, Iran did not stumble into confrontation. It prepared for it. Years of sanctions taught Iran a hard lesson early. If your economy runs on channels you do not control, you do not have sovereignty. So Iran did what the system fears most. It stopped asking for permission. Oil sold through alternative arrangements. Payments routed outside familiar rails. Trade structured to minimize exposure. Not loudly, not overnight, but consistently. And that consistency is what made it dangerous. Because oil is not just energy. Oil is the glue that holds the currency system together. For decades, oil was priced, settled, and stored in a way that guaranteed constant demand for a single dominant financial structure. That structure made massive debt possible. It allowed unlimited deficits. It made $38 trillion survivable. Break the link between oil and that currency, and the math starts to fail. This is why Iran cannot be tolerated, not because of ideology, not because of rhetoric, but because Iran proves something unacceptable, that oil can move without automatic obedience. History shows exactly how systems react to that idea. Saddam Hussein did not fall because he sold oil. He fell after signaling oil sales outside the dominant currency logic. Muammar Gaddafi was not removed because of speeches. He became a threat when he proposed a gold-backed dinar for African energy trade. Different leaders, different continents, same mistake. They touched the oil money circuit. Iran learned from those cases. Instead of making a grand announcement, it normalized alternatives, bilateral trade, local currencies, barter structures, gold settlements. Friction increased, efficiency dropped, but independence grew. And once one country proves it can endure that friction, others start calculating. This is where the story stops being about Iran alone. Russia enters, selling energy outside traditional settlement paths. China enters, paying for oil in yuan, stockpiling gold, building parallel payment infrastructure. And suddenly, the system faces something it was never designed to handle: coordination. This is where BRICS becomes more than an acronym. It becomes a laboratory, a place where countries test what trade looks like without automatic currency submission. Not to overthrow the system tomorrow, but to survive if it cracks. And cracks are already visible. Every deal settled differently, every reserve diversified, every shipment insured outside old frameworks. Each step small, together systemic. This is why pressure keeps escalating, why sanctions expand, why enforcement reaches across borders. Because this is no longer about punishing bad actors, it is about preventing imitation, and imitation is spreading. Iran is not isolated. Venezuela is not alone. They are signals that the currency war is entering a new phase, one where oil producers, rising powers, and debt-heavy systems are all moving at once. And when that happens, the rules stop being stable. In the final part, we are going to look at what comes next. What happens when control can no longer be enforced quietly, when fear replaces trust, and when the currency war moves from pressure to open confrontation. Now we reach the part nobody likes to talk about. What happens next? Because once a currency system relies on pressure instead of trust, there are only a few possible endings, and none of them are clean. The world is entering a phase where monetary control can no longer be enforced quietly. For decades, dominance worked because it felt invisible, automatic, inevitable. Countries used the system not because they loved it, but because there was no alternative. That era is ending. Not tomorrow, not all at once, but slowly enough to be dangerous. Every sanction used as punishment teaches others how to avoid sanctions. Every asset freeze teaches others how to hide assets. Every payment block teaches others how to build parallel rails. This is the paradox of enforcement. The harder you squeeze, the more creativity you create. And that creativity is now being institutionalized through bilateral trade, through gold accumulation, through regional payment systems, through blocks like BRICS expanding their scope. This does not mean the dominant currency disappears overnight. It means its monopoly weakens, and monopoly is the only thing that makes $38 trillion survivable. Without automatic global demand, debt stops being abstract. Interest costs rise. Refinancing becomes political. Printing becomes punishment instead of relief. This is why the reaction feels increasingly aggressive. Because the system is no longer defending prosperity, it is defending time. Time to roll debt. Time to delay reckoning. Time to keep the structure standing a little longer. And that is why pressure keeps shifting from economics to law to force. Arrests, seizures, sanctions that stretch across continents. Not because these tools are effective long term, but because trust is already leaking. And when trust disappears, coercion is all that is left. This is the real danger of the currency war. Not collapse, but fragmentation. A world split into financial camps, different settlement systems, different reserve assets, different rules. Trade still happens, energy still moves, but friction increases, costs rise, misunderstandings multiply, and history is clear about what happens next. Financial fragmentation always precedes political confrontation, not because anyone wants it, but because coordination becomes impossible. This is the price of a system that chooses enforcement over reform, that chooses control over credibility, and it leaves ordinary people exposed. Inflation becomes a silent tax. Savings lose value. Stability turns conditional, not because of bad policy in one country, but because the global monetary contract is breaking. So when you see the next headline about sanctions or seizures or sudden escalation, do not ask which country is being punished. Ask a deeper question. Which part of the system is cracking? Because empires do not fall when they lose wars. They fall when they lose the ability to make others believe in their money. And once belief fades, force can delay the outcome, but it can never reverse it. That is the quiet logic behind the currency war. And it is the reality the world is now learning to live with.